We ended the last section considering how we should treat androids, artificially intelligent beings, if they one day become a reality. This is an ethical or moral issue, a question about how we should or ought to act. It might also be a practical question, as we discussed. If we don't treat artificial intelligence with respect, they might rebel, take control, and punish us. Indeed, the threat of punishment, for example, the threat of being put in jail, can give us practical reasons to behave morally. But such questions of practicality are a different kind of question than the moral questions I have in mind. Setting possible punishments aside, how are we obligated ethically to act? Should we treat androids well? What would be morally best? And would treating them without respect violate their rights? Now, you might wonder why we're bothering to talk about morality given the doubts we previously raised about the possibility of human free will. Indeed, if humans do not have free will in the libertarian sense, many argue that we are not morally responsible for our actions. Fair enough. That is a good point. But an absence of moral responsibility doesn't entail an absence of moral facts. When it comes to the non-free choices that we make, certain options can still be morally superior to others, even if we can't really be morally blamed for choosing the inferior option. Besides, on the compatibilists' understanding of free will, we are morally responsible for our actions as long as we act in accordance with our wants and desires. And our ethical deliberations could inform our wants and desires and ultimately the choices we make. So, for now at least, let's assume that we are free, at least in the compatibilistic sense, to make our discussion easier. And while we're at it, there's something else we need to assume, that there actually are moral facts, that certain things are morally right and morally wrong. Now, in the first lecture, we discussed the problems with suggesting that moral facts are relative to individuals or cultures. We know that is false. But relativism is different than suggesting that there are no moral facts at all. And indeed, some philosophers suggest this. But for the sake of our purpose, we will begin by assuming that there are moral facts. It will be our goal to see if we can make sense of or ground this assumption. If we can't, we may have to consider the possibility that moral facts just don't exist at all. Okay, so let's begin. Intuitively, you might think that you can tell the difference between right and wrong, and it's true, some moral questions are easy. Is it morally acceptable to murder someone without cause? Of course not. But there are a great many moral questions that are very difficult to answer. 1. When, if ever, is abortion moral? To save a mother's life? In the case of rape or incest? In the case of unwanted pregnancy? How about another? When, if ever, is war morally justified? After all, war is mainly murdering people, and many of those who are killed are non-combatants. If you are defeating an evil enemy, is collateral damage justified? And how can you tell who's really evil and who's not? Don't your opponents think that you're evil? Under what conditions is it okay to kill another human being, if ever? Or if a person has been diagnosed with a terminal illness, should she have the right to terminate her own life in a medically controlled fashion? Is it morally acceptable for a doctor to help someone do so with her consent? Is there actually something morally wrong with homosexual activity? Is premarital sex really immoral? Both are forbidden by many religions. Is human cloning immoral? Or the classic, is it okay to steal a loaf of bread to feed your starving family? Not to mention the myriad of other ethical dilemmas that we might face on a daily basis. Should you tell a friend that his spouse is having an affair if you find out? Or are you obligated to give $1 to save a starving African child's life? Or to keep a puppy from being euthanized? Is it okay to lie to your friends about the way they look or how much you like them, or whether you think they're making a mistake with a big life decision. Answering moral questions is not always easy. If it were, people wouldn't disagree so fundamentally on moral issues. But such disagreements abound because, unlike questions in science, moral questions cannot be settled by an experiment or examining some part of the world. But this raises an important problem. Recall our favored theory of truth, the correspondence theory. A statement is true if it corresponds to the way the world is. To discover whether a proposition is true, we just have to figure out the way the world would be if it were true, and then figure out if the world actually is that way. If it is, we call that piece of the world that makes that proposition true, we call it the truth maker of that proposition, and we declare the statement true. But if moral statements can't be settled by looking at the world, then what could serve as a truth maker for a moral statement, like murder is wrong? What way would the world be if that's true? What piece of the world makes that true? Offhand, there doesn't seem to be anything. As humans put it, you can't get an ought from an is. You can't derive what ought to be the case from what actually is the case. Truth makers for moral statements are elusive. So a large part of what an ethicist does is try to find some alternative method for grounding the truth of moral statements. If one can be found, if we can figure out what it is that makes moral statements true, we should be able to find the moral knowledge we're seeking. Okay. The first ethical theory I want to consider is called emotivism. Emotivism came out of a school of thought in the philosophy of language inspired by the early writings of Ludwig Wittgenstein. It's called verificationism. Verificationism suggests that statements were meaningless unless they could be verified by empirical observation. Eventually, it gave rise to an entire movement in philosophy called logical positivism, championed most notably by a philosopher named A.J. Ayer. Positivism ruled philosophy for the first half of the 20th century. And to make sense of most ethical statements, some positivists suggested that moral statements were really just a different way of expressing emotions, hence the name emotivism. To say that murder is morally wrong really is just to say, boo murder. To say that charity is morally good is just to say, yay charity. The implications of this are debatable. On the one hand, it doesn't seem that boo murder can be true. And on verificationism, this would seem to mean that it's not meaningful either. You can't verify boo murder. But if emotivism is right, you can at least understand to some degree what is implied when someone says that murder is wrong. On the other hand, you might think that boo murder really just amounts to I don't like murder. And that can be meaningful. That can even be true. The state of affairs of me not liking murder would be its truth maker. Exactly what you think that truth maker is will be determined by what your favorite philosophy of mind is, whether or not liking something is a mental action or a brain event. Nevertheless, it seems that I do not like murder is a state of affairs, a way the world is. By reducing moral statements to statements about ourselves, we could find truth makers for them in the real world. But the problem with emotivism is twofold. First, verificationism is self-refuting. You can't verify that meaning requires verification. This is largely what led to the downfall of logical positivism. So emotivism arises out of a defunct philosophy. Moral statements need not be verifiable to be meaningful. Secondly, emotivism is just false. Moral statements are not merely an expression of our emotions. When someone says that you shouldn't do something or that murder is wrong, they don't simply mean that they don't like it. They don't just simply mean boo murder. After all, some people like doing immoral things even knowing that they are immoral. What some people mean by saying that an act is immoral is that God disapproves of it. This reflects the second theory I wish to consider, divine command theory. It suggests that which is morally good is good because God commands it, and that which is morally wrong is wrong because God forbids it. In this way, divine command theory provides truth makers for moral statements. They are not found in facts in the physical world, but in facts about what God has commanded and forbidden. Of course, this theory has one obvious initial flaw. A full defense of divine command theory would require establishing knowledge of God's existence, and as we've discussed in previous lectures, that is most likely just a matter of faith, not knowledge. But let us set this matter aside so that we may consider the theory itself. Divine command theory is one of the oldest ethical theories around, one that Plato dealt with well over 2,000 years ago in a dialogue called Euthyphro. Of course, the divine in the theory back then wasn't the Judeo-Christian God. Plato was Greek and lived long before Jesus was born. The divine commands that concerned Plato came from the Greek gods, like Zeus and Apollo. And actually, the best translation of what Plato was concerned about in the Euthyphro was piety, which is not exactly the same as morality, but as we shall see, the same problem that arises for piety arises for morality as well. The setting for the Euthyphro is outside the court of Athens. Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father for murder because he killed one of his family's servants. Socrates has been called to the court because, well, the real reason is still debated. The official charges include corrupting the youth and refusing to recognize the gods of the state. I personally think the high-ranking citizens of the court made these charges, they trumped them up, because Socrates had annoyed and humiliated a number of them in his quest for knowledge, including knowledge of piety. At any rate, Socrates doesn't wish to stand trial and figures that if he goes into the court saying that he has found knowledge of piety, it will be of great help to him. And who would know better than Euthyphro? Socrates figures what piety is, because who would prosecute his own father for murder without knowing for sure that it was the right thing to do? And how could he know that without knowing what the very definition of piety is? But when Euthyphro gives his definition, Socrates is disappointed. To do as I am doing, Euthyphro says, prosecuting the impious. I'm paraphrasing here. Socrates points out that although prosecuting the impious is certainly an example of a kind of pious action, there are obviously other kinds. Socrates wants to know what all and only pious actions have in common that makes them pious. Oh, Euthyphro says, it's being loved by the gods that makes actions pious. But, Socrates asks, isn't it commonly believed that the gods often disagree on such matters? If one god loves something and another then hates it, well, that would mean the action is both pious and impious, and that's just illogical nonsense. Quite right, Euthyphro admits, but certainly there are things that all the gods agree on. That must be what makes something pious, being loved by all the gods. Well, certainly this is something that all and only pious actions have in common, Socrates points out. But is that what makes them pious? After all and only your family members live in the same house. But living in the same house is not what makes them family. Indeed, it seems that the reason the gods all agree that certain things are pious is because they recognize something about pious things that makes them pious. Otherwise, how could they all agree? In other words, the gods love pious actions because they are pious. Those actions are not pious because the gods love them. Oh, quite right, Socrates, says Euthyphro. So we are still left wondering what makes that which is pious pious. So we must start again from the beginning. Yeah, I gotta go, Socrates. Euthyphro leaves and the dialogue ends. He didn't really have a watch. It's not clear whether or not Socrates convinces Euthyphro that he doesn't know whether prosecuting his father is actually the right thing to do. Indeed, there is scholarly debate about whether or not Euthyphro has already done so when the dialogue begins. But the argument regarding piety that both Socrates and Euthyphro agree is sound can be applied to modern divine command theory as well. God commanding something is not what makes it moral. God commands things because they are moral, because he recognizes something about them that makes them good. What we want to know is, what exactly does God see in them? What makes them so good that God commands them? Another way of understanding this criticism is to realize that if divine command theory is true, then what is moral and immoral is arbitrary. To see why, suppose that divine command theory is true, and so love is good and murder is bad because God commands the former and forbids the latter. Notice that if the reverse were true, and God had commanded murder and forbidden love, then on divine command theory, murder would be moral and love would be immoral. But that just doesn't seem right. Now, at this point, everyone says, yeah, but God would never do that, right? But there are two reasons this response does not save divine command theory from this objection. First, a standard way of testing ethical theories or definitions of morality is to check them against your moral intuitions. If an ethical theory entails that something which is clearly wrong in all circumstances is actually morally right in some circumstances, for example, if an ethical theory entails that in certain circumstances it's okay to torture babies for fun, well, that's a really good reason to think that that ethical theory is faulty. In fact, let's use that as our example to make this objection clear. My intuition suggests that there is no circumstance in which it is ever morally acceptable to torture a baby for fun. And if anyone ever said, yeah, it may seem that way, but if, I would say, but if nothing. There is no possible way that you could finish that if statement and have it be true. There is no circumstance in which that is ever okay. However, on divine command theory, there is a circumstance in which it would be okay, the circumstance of God commanding it. On divine command theory, the following statement is true. If God commanded torturing babies for fun, then it would be moral. And the fact that he would not do so does not keep such a statement from being true. But clearly, that statement is false. If divine command theory suggests that it's true, then divine command theory must be false. And FYI, that line of reasoning is valid by modus tollens. The other problem with trying to save divine command theory by suggesting that God would never command something like baby torture is that by doing so, you're actually suggesting that divine command theory is false. The reason you think that God would never command baby torture is because there is something about it that makes it horrendously evil. You think it's awful and that God would never command something that is so awful. But that means that you think God recognizes something in it that makes it immoral. If that which is good is simply defined by God's command, there is actually nothing about baby torture that would keep God from commanding it. By suggesting that God wouldn't ever command it, you're actually endorsing the notion that there is something about it that makes it immoral, and thus endorsing the notion that divine command theory is false. You can test your intuitions about whether you're a divine command theorist by considering the following scenario. Suppose God appeared to you in the sky. For fun, let's pretend it would look like it did in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. So suppose God pops up through the clouds and you know for sure that it's God. But then he commands you to bash some babies' heads in against the rocks. What would you do? Again, you might think God would never do this, but according to the Old Testament, he actually did command the Israelites to do this to the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15, 2-3. And as we discussed in a previous lecture, God praised those who would do it to the Babylonians in Psalm 137, 8-9. Now, in this experiment, up to this point, you had thought that God was an all-good being, but you also thought that bashing babies' heads against the rocks was immoral. But given what just happened, one of these beliefs has now got to go. So what do? You change your attitude about the morality of bashing babies' heads against the rocks, or change your attitude about God being good? Would you go off and start bashing babies' heads in, or would you say, yeah, I'm not so sure I should be listening to you anymore? If you're like most, and I hope you are, you would not harm any babies and would instead change your attitude about God. If so, then you're not a divine command theorist, because you think there's something about bashing babies' heads against the rocks that makes it wrong, regardless of whether God commands it or not. The previously mentioned Old Testament passages actually put us in a similar situation in the real world. Either your belief that God is good has got to go, given those passages, or you have to think that whoever wrote those biblical verses is wrong and God didn't actually command dashing of infants' heads upon the rocks. To save divine command theory from this objection, some have suggested modifying the theory. That which is moral not because it's commanded by God, but because it's like God. Love is moral because God loves. You should love everyone because God loves everyone. You should not torture babies because God wouldn't. You should not murder because God is the kind of being that would not murder. It's not God's commands, but his character that defines what is good. But ultimately, this response just moves the objection up to another level. According to this theory, the following is true. Baby torture would be immoral unless God's character were different than it is. And again, my intuition suggests that baby torture is wrong unless nothing. To get out of this problem, one might suggest that God's character can't be different than it is. But again, this would be true only if there were some standard of goodness apart from God. Of course, if God is immutable, then God's character can't be different than it already is. But if there is no standard of goodness beyond God's character could have been anything, and thus anything, even baby torture, could have been good. Besides, if what is good is, by definition, just whatever matches up to the way God is, then how can God get moral credit for anything he does? Normally, we give others moral credit when they could have done evil, but instead chose to do the good. But if, no matter what God does or what way he is, he's just good by default, by definition, then what moral credit could God ever get? Don't we want to say that God chooses to do the good instead of saying that he always does the good by definition? Because that's just what he does is always by definition good. But even if we ignore all of these problems and embrace divine command theory anyway, it still falls short because it can't generate moral knowledge. For one thing, as I've mentioned, we've already discussed the difficulties with proving God's existence. How much more difficult would it be to prove that God commanded one thing and not the other? There are literally thousands upon thousands of different interpretations of what God wants throughout human history. And the only reason any one of them catches on is just a historical accident. Of course, you might think that one version, say the Bible, caught on because it's the best version, it's true. But as we've already seen, God commands some clearly immoral things in the Bible, like merciless infant murder. So even if you do think the Bible contains God's commands, you will still have to figure out which parts are God's commands and which parts aren't. And apart from using your moral intuition, which really isn't going to give you knowledge, you are not going to be able to answer such questions. So you'll still lack moral knowledge. Secondly, the idea that the Bible contains God's commands really is just a matter of faith. As most people admit, I don't have to get into it here. If you're curious about it, go check out one of Bart Ehrman's courses. But as we've discussed, faith can't get you knowledge. Faith is belief without justification. So faith that the Bible contains God's commands is not going to give you knowledge of what God's commands are, and thus will not give you knowledge about what is moral and immoral. So again, divine command theory doesn't generate moral knowledge. Lastly, and I have to admit, this is my own objection to divine command theory, but it's not clear to me that divine command theory provides what the ethicist is looking for. a truth maker for moral statements. Suppose God commands some action X. That fact, that state of affairs, if you will, of God commanding X, only provides a truth maker for the following statement: God commanded X. I'm still left wondering, how could it be that God commanding something is what makes it moral, right? Now, God commanding X would allow us to figure out that X is moral. If we assume that God would only command moral things, then the fact that God commanded X logically entails that X is moral. But logical entailment is not an explanation or a truth maker. For example, my clock is accurate and it shows that it's 11:12 p.m., let's say, and at 11:12 p.m., it's dark. Logically, those two things entail that 3, it's dark outside. But 1 and 2 are not what make it dark outside. In the same way, God commanding X would logically entail that X is moral, but it wouldn't make it moral. Let me see if I can explain this better by analogy. Suppose I'm wondering whether something is legal. Say, for example, can I download a movie I already own on VHS and burn it to DVD for my own personal use? You're not supposed to download movies for free, but I already paid for it, right? I just want it in a usable format. Suppose I know that the president has a perfect knowledge of the law. So I ask the president, and the president says it's illegal. I can thus conclude that it's illegal to download and burn to a DVD a movie I already own on VHS. But the fact that the president said it was illegal is not what makes it illegal. The president doesn't decide what the laws are. The executive branch only enforces the laws. The fact that the president said it's illegal can only serve as a truth maker for the statement, the president said it was illegal. I can deduce from what the president said that it is indeed illegal, but the president's words are not what make it illegal. In the same way, the fact that God commanded X is only a truth maker for a proposition, God commanded X. Assuming that God exists and is all good, we can deduce from this that X is moral, but that's not the same thing as God's commands being the truth maker for X is moral. Now, you might think that God's commands are more like Congress passing a law. Congress saying something is illegal is what makes it illegal. But I don't think that analogy quite works because that's just a social convention. Congress's commands are laws only because we agree to treat them as laws, but that's not how divine command theory works. I'll let the strength of the analogy be a question for you to consider on your own. At any rate, if morality were defined by what God commands, then wouldn't there only be debates about what God has commanded and forbidden, instead of the debates that we do have about what actually constitutes morality? And if morality were defined by God's commands, then wouldn't it be impossible for our conception of morality to have predated our conception of the Judeo-Christian God? Convincing someone that God has forbidden something and that they will burn in hell forever for doing it may be an effective way to convince someone not to do something, but that is not what makes that action immoral. And worse still, the reasoning behind divine command theory may simply be straight out fallacious. In previous lectures, we discussed the error of filling in conceptual or explanatory gaps with God. We call the mystery, therefore magic fallacy, when people interject their favorite supernatural explanation for that which has yet to be explained. It's a variety of the appeal to ignorance fallacy, where an inability to prove that the supernatural explanation is wrong by finding an actual natural explanation is taken to be evidence that the supernatural explanation is right. We see this move in arguments for everything from alien abductions to creationism. Recall what we learned from Plato in the Cratylus while we were asking, why is there something rather than nothing? To say that God did it is not to actually offer an explanation, but to simply offer an excuse for not having one. As the contemporary philosopher Theodor Schick argues, God did it will always fall short abductively as an explanation for natural phenomena. Well, for similar reasons, it seems that God did it falls short as an explanation for moral facts. Divine command theory is yet another instance of the mystery, therefore magic fallacy. As we'll soon see, discovering moral truths, and in particular the truth makers for moral statements, is a difficult task indeed. But that's not a legitimate excuse for invoking the supernatural to solve that problem. Such an explanation certainly is not intellectually satisfying. It's basically equivalent to just saying, it's just magic. So, we are still left wondering how we can discover moral truths and what serves as the truth maker for them. But when we consider things that are clearly evil, like murder and baby torture, they seem to have something in common. They cause pain. And when we consider things that are good, like charity, they tend to cause pleasure or happiness. So perhaps that's what makes the good good, the fact that it causes happiness and or the absence of pain. It is to such suggestions that we shall turn next lecture. In this section, we're asking the question, what is morally right and morally wrong? To answer this question, however, we need to ask, in virtue of what is it the case that certain things are morally right and other things are morally wrong? It would seem that only then could we ultimately discover, in all cases, what is right and wrong. So what we need is a truth maker for moral truths. We've already identified the difficulty in finding physical states of the world to which moral statements could correspond. But is there perhaps another way to find states of affairs that could serve as truth makers for moral statements? Well, one suggestion is this. Since moral questions are usually about what actions we should or should not perform, perhaps we can figure out whether an action is morally right or wrong by looking at the consequences of performing that action, the effect in the world that performing that action will have. Such ethical questions are called consequentialist theories. But 100 years after Plato criticized divine command theory in the Euthyphro, another Greek philosopher named Epicurus proposed an early consequentialist theory called hedonism. Now, the word hedonism has a bad reputation today, but its meaning has been skewed over the years and no longer really refers to what Epicurus had in mind. Epicurus thought that you could determine whether you ought to perform an action based on how beneficial to you performing that action was. And for Epicurus, benefit was found in the absence of pain and the attainment of pleasure or happiness. But why did he think such things were important consequences to consider? Because he saw happiness in the absence of pain as something that was intrinsically good. In fact, he thought they were the only intrinsic good. But what does it mean for something to be an intrinsic good? Well, I often demonstrate this concept in class by asking my students why they're in my class. Most of them admit it's simply because it's required. But what is it required for? Their college degree. But why do they want a college degree? Because they think they'll be able to get a better job with one. Well, why do you want a better job? Well, because they think they'll make more money. Well, why do you want more money? Because with more money, I'll be able to get the things that I want, a nice house, a stable life, a regular vacations, a family, etc. And why do you want these things? Well, because I think they will make me happy. And this seems to be the end to the inquiry. That's where it bottoms out. If I ask a further question, well, why do you want to be happy? They just look at me funny. Being happy is just good. There is no other reason to be happy other than to be happy. All these other things are means to an end, happiness. And happiness is good for its own sake. This is what it means for happiness to be an intrinsic good, good in and of itself. As Epicurus put it, pleasure is our first and kindred good. It is the starting point of every choice and of every aversion, and to it we always come back, inasmuch as we make feeling the rule by which to judge of every good thing. Conversely, pain is an intrinsic evil. You may do something for the purpose of avoiding pain, but you don't avoid pain for the purpose of anything else. Pain is something to avoid in and of itself. And so Epicurus thought that one could judge the immorality of an action on whether or not it caused one pain. And since he thought happiness was the only intrinsic good and pain the only intrinsic evil, it made sense for Epicurus to suggest that whether or not one should perform an action is determined solely by whether it caused happiness or pain. After all, he formulated this theory a long time ago, long before governments or societies were organized in such a way to make sure that people had their basic needs met, had medical care, or would lead anything resembling what we today would call a comfortable life. For someone who lived over 2,000 years ago, it made a lot of sense to look out solely for your own happiness, because likely no one else was going to. Not looking out for yourself would likely have seemed to be kind of a stupid and irresponsible thing to do. But it's important to distinguish Epicurean hedonism from the image that the word hedonist usually brings up in people's minds today. You might think, for example, of a frat boy whose goal is to make himself happy by getting drunk and getting laid. Or maybe you even think, as I often do, of Hedonism Bot from Futurama, a laurel-wearing Roman-looking robot that spends all of his time eating grapes and seeking momentary pleasures. But these goals are too short-sighted for Epicurus. His goal was long-term happiness, an overall happy life. Such pleasures are often short-lived and can even stand in the way of such a goal by leading to alcoholism and STDs and obesity, etc. Understanding this, I used to think Epicurus would endorse the approach of someone like Jordan Belfort, the stockbroker who wrote The Wolf of Wall Street, which Martin Scorsese made into a movie starring Leonardo DiCaprio. Belfort worked hard and made sacrifices, but ultimately made millions. Of course, he did this by tricking people into horrible investments, but it made him rich and famous and gave him access to a lifetime of all the sex and drugs he wanted. Of course, things didn't work out all that great for Belfort in the long run, so I thought maybe a better example of Epicurean hedonist would be like a hardworking college kid with long-term goals. He studies hard in college and doesn't go to parties and that kind of stuff so he can get a good job, make lots of money, and then live a life of luxury, buy a huge house and a boat and consume fine wine and food and travel the world. But after reading Epicurus more closely, I realized that such lives would not be in line with Epicurean hedonism at all. Let me quote Epicurus. When we say then that pleasure is the end and the aim, we do not mean the pleasures of the prodigal or the pleasures of sensuality. By pleasure, we mean the absence of pain in the body and of trouble in the soul. It is not an unbroken succession of drinking bouts and of revelry, not sexual lust, not the enjoyment of fish and other delicacies of a luxurious table which produce a pleasant life.